I'm Vicente Fonseca, and the problem that I chose was ableism. Ableism refers to bias, prejudice, and discrimination against people with disabilities. And the reason I chose this problem is because disabled people represent the largest marginalized group worldwide. They represent about 15% of the total global population. And this is why ableism is one of the most common types of prejudice. This largely occurs because there's a widespread implicit bias against disabled people. Studies have shown that about 75% of people have some sort of bias against disabled people. How does ableism manifest in Mexico? So INEGI has found that about a quarter of all disabled people have been discriminated against. And when the Human Rights Watch conducted research and interviews with disabled people in Mexico, out of the 140 people they interviewed, they found that most of them had experienced some sort of domestic abuse. And this can range from psychological to outright physical and medical neglect. And on the other hand, this also manifests in the education system. El Sol de Hidalgo made an article saying that students with disabilities, be it auditory, motor, intellectual, psychosocial, or visual, often lag behind in their education, and they are way more likely to drop out than able-bodied students. To understand disability and ableism, we have to understand the two main models that explain disability. The medical model of disability states that the cause of disability is the person's conditions. And this is why, in order to fix disability, you have to fix the person, and you have to see what's wrong with the person in order to fix it. And this is very evident in people with cognitive disabilities. So a lot of the time, society asks of neurodivergent people the same that they would ask to neurotypical people. And when neurodivergent people are not able to give the same, it's blamed on them or their condition instead of a society that failed to adapt. And this is why the social model of disability was created by disabled people. And this one states that the cause of disability is not the person's conditions per se, but the way that society is organized and how it's failed to adapt to different person's conditions. This is why, in order to remove disability, the social model seeks to remove the barriers that have been put in place by society. And this way, they want to give disabled people independence, something that the medical model actively seeks to take away from disabled people. Ableism can be classified in three ways according to the level of society that they operate in. So the highest one is the institutional one. So ableism in the medical field, the legal institutions, police, education, hiring, housing, media, and political power, where disabled people are often neglected. So like in the medical field, they are not taken into account. So in political power, in housing, hiring, education, or they're even abused, like with police, that it's so common that the police are abusive towards disabled people. The second level is the interpersonal level, and this manifests as jokes, slurs, stereotypes, threats, physical assault, and bullying. And I would say that this is something that most of us have taken part of because of how ingrained in society ableism is. And the third level is the internalized one, which is when the disabled person has come to believe themselves that they are inferior, not only because society has failed to adapt to their condition and they are unable to do what everyone else is able to do, but also because of all the ableism that they are constantly being attacked by the rest of society. Ableism can also be classified according to their intentions. So for example, we have hostile ableism, which manifests as aggressive behaviors and policies, bullying, abuse, and medical negligence. And this is sort of the most visible type of ableism, and the one that most people agree is not okay. The second type is benevolent ableism. This manifests as paternalism, overprotection, and sheltering, and this mostly comes from the disabled person's guardians, which often don't see their disabled child as another person. They see it as something that's very fragile that they have to protect. And this is harmful because it takes away from the agency of the disabled person. And the third one is ambivalent, which mixes both depending on the situation and the implicit bias of the person. So for example, someone might say that they love autistic children and that they're so smart and they are funny, but as soon as the autistic child has a breakdown or says something or does something that's considered socially inappropriate, then this person turns hostile towards the autistic child. And I feel like this is something that most people do, mostly because they are misinformed or they have deeply ingrained implicit biases. Some of the traces that I was able to identify were, for one, eugenics, which is the discipline of trying to improve the genetic lineage, be this by, well, killing or sterilizing people, or in the case, for example, of autism, the biggest organization, the biggest autistic advocacy organization is called Autism Speaks. And they are regarded by many autistic people as a eugenicist organization because they not only do they see autism as something that needs to be fixed, but they're actively seeking to find a cure for autism. And this eugenicist thinking also makes society more okay with letting disabled people die, because in their minds, they don't want the disabled genes to pass to another generation. There's also the difference in communication. So a lot of the time, it's not that disabled people cannot communicate or interact properly with able-bodied or neurotypical people. It's that they operate under two different systems. So for example, a study conducted in 2020, they made three groups of people, a group with only autistic people, a group with neurotypical people, and a group with both autistic people and neurotypical people. And they were tested on their communication skills. And the study found that both the purely autistic and the purely neurotypical groups were able to communicate as effectively. But the problem came with the mixed group. And that's where there were communication barriers, and autistic people felt like there was some sort of difference in communication that they couldn't get through. There's also capitalism, which capitalism always reinforces every system of oppression. And in the case of ableism, something that capitalism has created that affects negatively the lives of disabled people are, for example, the 40-hour work week, productivity culture, which mostly affects neurodiverse and sometimes physically impaired people, and also big pharma, which medical treatment is something that a lot of disabled people depend on to just be able to live. And capitalism has made it so they have to pay for that privilege. There's also the physical barriers that affect a lot of disabled people. So this isn't only like when there's no elevators or ramps in buildings, making them inaccessible, but it's also when cities are built around cars, there's no space for sidewalks, or sidewalks are inappropriate, and the residential sprawl, which just puts everything in the city further away from each other, and this negatively affects many disabled people. And for last, there's the harmful media representation, which I've noticed that disabled characters are never treated like actual people. They're never given that full treatment. And a lot of the time, they fall into a few categories. They can either be the villains, like many villains are actually coded as autistic, and this perpetuates a negative stereotype. As autistic, or they have schizophrenia, or they have dissociative identity disorder, DID, or split personality. It's either that, or they are portrayed as these virtuous beings that can do no wrong and that fight through adversities and are somehow elevated to some other status, but still not given the full treatment of a rounded character. They are very one-sided. And this also negatively affects disabled people. According to the sense of place, well, disabled people are constantly reminded of the space that they occupy, because they have to constantly interact with it and get around it. However, they also experience a sense of placelessness, because society never considers them when it builds its places, its structures, its systems. And in sense of belonging, I would say that modern society was not built to host the diversity of human experience, and this makes it so disabled people can never feel like they truly belong somewhere. The power relations that create ableism are, the biggest one is obviously able-bodied people and institutions against disabled bodies, because able-bodied people institutions always exert some sort of violence against disabled bodies. However, this is also exacerbated by systems like racism and misogyny. So, for example, there have been many cases in the United States where Black autistic teens get the police called on them because of their, you could say, weird behavior. And because they fail to communicate with the police, what ends up happening is they end up arrested, or in the worst case scenario, being shot and sometimes killed. And with misogyny is it's mostly in the medical field, since there's the widespread belief in the medical field that women are that women can get through pain easier, and that they're often just hysteric and faking their symptoms, and they experience a larger percentage of medical neglect. And in some beliefs about disabled people that exist in general society are, well, there are many biases against disabled people. So, for example, that they don't work hard, or that they just take money from the government and they are draining the taxes. There's also polarized thinking about disabled people. So they're either these creatures that can do no wrong, or they are a burden and they shouldn't exist, and they're violent. There's there's never any middle ground. And the third belief is that most society sees disabled people as a burden, be it in the medical field, or in the government, or just in general society. Maybe even in their own families, they see them as burdens. No. Some feasible solutions are, for one, always offer more options. This is because disabled people are very diverse and require different adaptations. And always offering different options, more variety, makes it so disabled people can adapt better to situations. For example, a lot of neurodiverse people experience sensory processing disorders, or are very prone to sensory overload. So they might need different little adaptations to make them get through things better. And this can also benefit non-disabled people. So, for example, with physical adaptations like ramps and elevators, not only do they benefit wheelchair users, but also many old people, which I would argue that most old people are disabled, even though they don't admit it. Another solution would be to hire and recruit more disabled people. This is because I think that a big cause of ableism is because disabled people are forced to retreat and hide from the rest of society. So by hiring and recruiting more disabled people, people have to interact with able-bodied people have to interact with disabled people, and they would no longer seem like such a minority, because as we saw, they represent 15% of the global population. And finally, another solution, I think, would be to check on the disabled people you know. This is because, well, domestic abuse within disabled people is very common, especially in Mexico. And it's very hard for disabled people to speak out about it, because they depend on their families. So it's better to always check in on them and look for signs of abuse, but also because it's very important to learn about different disabilities and how they affect different aspects of someone's life, because disabilities aren't one-dimensional. They affect every single aspect of a person's life, and this might broaden someone's horizons or make it so they can interact with disabled people better. Thank you.